Hi, everybody, and I'm Dylan Siegler, and I'm the Director of Partnerships and Engagement here at the Institute of Politics, and have the great pleasure of working with some of our colleagues to run the Shriver Program for Leadership in Public Service. And this is supported by the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute and the Shriver family, and we're so grateful for that. So this is the second workshop of a 4-part series. If you did not have a chance to come to last week's workshop, we will make sure that everybody who's attended here gets sent the link to the video, and then similarly each week we'll have these videos and you can watch them online. Just a couple of housekeeping items. So the meat of this program is really looking at the creation of the Peace Corps and everything that went into not only making this incredible program exist, but having it, be so sustainable over, many more than 50 years even, and just having brought such impact to both the individuals who serve as volunteers in the Peace Corps as well as to the communities where they've served. And so we're taking a look at how the scope of a program like that, how it got created, and all of the different components that went into that. And I'm going to let our experts tell you more. What happens with the Shriver program is we're having these 4 workshops, and we're making sure that people are either able to attend here or watch the videos. And then we're very excited that for undergraduate students, all undergraduates, let me be clear, first years, second years, third years, and fourth years, you may apply for the Shriver Undergraduate Fellowship. And so what is that? The Shriver Undergraduate Fellowship is an opportunity to work very closely with us here and with Jamie Price and Bill Josephson during the winter and spring quarters. And in our mind, you will be given a challenge, something like, develop a Chicago Peace Corps, whatever that means. You will be given a challenge and you will work with us to make that program happen. And you will learn everything and anything along the way that looking into and trying to found a program like that means. At the end of the spring quarter, we will have a $4,000 internship stipend reserved for you, for the Shriver Undergraduate Fellows. What I mean by that is, if you create a program that needs interns, that's something that you could then work on over the summer of 2015. If it's a program where it has a life of its own and you're going to intern somewhere else, we're going to say to you, where do you want to go work? Where do you want to intern and take a lot of these skills that you've developed? And so we would really see the internship component as something that has a lot of room for you to kind of decide, where can I apply what I've learned? Where can I do relevant work? And things like that. So I've heard a little bit that people are kind of confused about the internship, and we really want to say it's pretty open, and we're going to be right there alongside you, helping make sure it's an opportunity to really apply the skills that you've learned throughout the year. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Are there any quick questions about that before I introduce our 2 speakers? Okay, and myself and Nicole Bittler, who probably you've gotten way too many emails from, are happy to answer any questions at any time. So I wanted to introduce Bill Josephson and Jamie Price. The best thing I will tell you about both of them, they are alumni. Woohoo! Yay! And so Bill is an alumnus of the college.
Of the college.
And the law school?
No, just the college.
And Jamie is an alumnus of the Divinity School. He has his PhD from there. And Bill was, I'm just giving you a couple of fun facts about them. You received their bios last week, was the general counsel for the Peace Corps and was a huge part of making it exist. And so he's an absolute expert in what it is that we're looking at. He then was a partner at Fried Frank in New York for many years and still is?
Since 66.
Since 66.
With a brief interlude as head of the Charities Bureau.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Under Elliot.
Okay.
Spitzer.
I love it. And Jamie currently is executive director of the Sargent Shriver Peace Institute, and he is also a professor of conflict analysis and resolution at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And so I'm going to turn it over to the 2 of them to lead us through creating the Peace Corps, the challenge of social innovation.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to do this slide? Well, we're very happy to be back with a good number of you, it looks like, and to welcome those of you who couldn't make it last time. we wanted to rearrange the room. This was mostly Bill's idea because there were a couple of logistical issues. One, he felt I kind of kept turning to the right and not looking left, making eye contact, so that wasn't good. The second thing's that I had some blind spots and people were raising their hands and I didn't.
This is one of the things you learn in politics, you know.
It is. The other thing that, along those lines, that Bill said I needed to change, and I don't know if I can because it's a pretty ingrained habit, is that I have this tendency, apparently, to put my left hand in my pocket as I talk.
Another no-no. Never put your hands in your pockets. Of course, women don't have to worry about that much.
Depends on
See?
what they're wearing. I know.
Every
I
time he
demonstrated.
does, I'm going to squawk.
So you can be a chorus of squawkers, and I'm sure you can pay attention to anything else other than what Jamie's doing with his left hand. I hope I can think of something else too. The other thing is, last time there won't be. Well, I don't know if there are going to be as many slides as last time. There will be fewer videos, only one this time. But last time, my voice and Bill's was prominent, and we'd like to move that out a little bit. So what I'm going to ask you to do, this is sort of forewarning, is to when there's a slide of something Sarge says or a slide of Kennedy's, when there's a slide, I constructed them for you guys, and I would love it if you would read them so that we hear them aloud, and we'll just sort of go around. There are probably 20 or so of them, so most of you will have a chance. If you don't feel comfortable doing that or can't see it or something, that's totally fine. We just like to mix the voices.
And also, you know, the format here is going to be a little different because Jamie is going to prompt me a lot from the documents that have been distributed to you. And, you know, from last time, you know, I do tell stories. So, you know, if you're interested in a story and you want to know more about it or you want to pursue it further, don't hesitate to speak out. And because, you know, one of the ways we all learn, stories are a wonderful way to learn.
That's right. So please, if you have questions, ask anytime. If something isn't clear or you're wondering about something, wave a hand, and we'll try to pick it up. Okay, so this is what we're doing. It's the second one, the challenge of social innovation. And here he is. It's one of our favorite photos of Sarge. And it's, the 7th of November today. So Sunday, which is 2 days from now, Sarge would be 99. So it's almost happy birthday to him. The next slide gives you the sort of timeline that we're dealing with, that we dealt with last time and that we're going to be dealing with today. On the 21st, for those of you here who remember, that's when Sarge had just returned from the inauguration, just returned from campaigning for Kennedy, running the Civil Rights Division. He'd just come back to Chicago, was in his home, and his brother-in-law, now the president, called and asked him to lead a task force for the Peace Corps. It wasn't decided at this point that he would be the director. So he did that, turned around, went back to DC to do that. As we'll talk a little bit. Last time we did the history of the genesis of the idea, and you'll know that it came late in the campaign, that it was a very exciting idea, but nobody knew exactly what the Peace Corps was supposed to be, nor Sarge. And so we talked last time about the fact that as a leader, when you have a problem to solve, when you're given a huge challenge, you need to have a methodology to solve that problem. We'll talk a little bit about that, and then the purpose today is to move forward in this time period to talk about how Sarge used, what that method was, how Sarge used that method to develop the policies and procedures of the Peace Corps to meet the challenges, which were set forth again by President Kennedy in his State of the Union. We'll begin with that. The task force was meeting. You can see these are very tight timelines. They had, and it was 3 weeks, well, 1 month, but 3 weeks between the time that JFK gave his State of the Union address and they began to sit around the table at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington to figure out what the Peace Corps was, to the time that they delivered the final report for the president's approval, and then 10 days later, less than 10 days later, a week later, Kennedy signed an executive order and delivered a special message to Congress. So all this happened very fast. And to create something like this very quickly, you need a method, you need powerful people like Bill, who was with Sarge at the time, and you need to make a lot of decisions. So we're going to kind of go through the method as well as some of the decisions he had to make, the proposals he looked at, and why some of the procedures were decided. So we'll go to the State of the Union address first. Would one of you, this is the opening paragraph of JFK's State of the Union. Would one of you be willing to read that? Please, thank you.
I speak today in an hour of national peril and national opportunity. Before my term is ended, we shall have to test anew whether a nation organized and governed such as ours can endure. The outcome is by no means certain. The answers are by no means clear. All of us together, this administration, this Congress, this nation, must forge those answers.
Thank you. I've been given this. Have you been able to hear me back there? It's okay. Just, I guess my voice goes in. Next slide. So the huge sense of peril. Can we stay on that table? Thanks.
Sorry.
With a mouthful. Appreciate it.
Our greatest challenge is still the world that lies beyond the Cold War. The first great obstacle is still our relations with the Soviet Union and Communist China. We must never be lulled into believing that either power has yielded its ambition for world domination, ambitions which they forcefully stated only a short time ago.
So there's a real, as he put it, there's a real sense of peril. There's the Cold War. There's also the threat of a very global hot war. And in President Kennedy's mind, there's the real challenge as to whether or not a country built like this one can survive. One of his challenges, and the challenge he gave to Sergeant Shriver, was to have the Peace Corps be a demonstration that it could, or one of the vehicles for that. And on the final slide, before we turn it over to Bill, the challenge and the obstacle. Dan?
Our role is essential and unavoidable in the construction of a sound and expanding economy for the entire non-communist world, helping other nations build the strength to meet their own problems, to satisfy their own aspirations, to surmount their own dangers. The problems in achieving this goal are towering and unprecedented, and the response must be towering and unprecedented as well.
Go ahead.
You ready for me?
I'm ready for you.
So I mentioned last time a little bit about the setting in which President and Sarge and the task force confronted the issue of the Peace Corps. And I'd just like to read a couple of other excerpts from the State of the Union message, which is in your documents. You may find some of this familiar. Nearly 1/8 of those are without jobs and without hope. Our recovery from the 1958 recession, moreover, is anemic and incomplete. This is from a long passage in the State of the Union on the economic situation that the country faces. Meanwhile, this country has continued to bear more than its share of the West's military and foreign aid obligations. Sound familiar? What has really changed? He talks about the confrontation with the Soviet Union. He discusses what is going on in Africa, what is going on in Latin America, what is going on in Asia. He discusses the rise of China and the issues that that poses. In Europe, our alliances are unfulfilled and in some disarray. Sound familiar? So I read these excerpts to underline the sense of urgency which the president felt the country faced. And it's striking to me that in that context, he thinks that the Peace Corps is a very important program.
I just wanted to say real quick, the documents we have in a Dropbox that we share with you guys that we'll make sure that you have access to, okay? So, just so everyone's aware.
And the reason that Bill and I wanted to stress the urgency of it is that it strikes me as I talk to people about the Peace Corps and about other programs that have been around for 50 and more years, that they just seem part of the social and political landscape. I mean, the Peace Corps is an option. You know, some people go to the Peace Corps, some people don't. But the notion of it as a real effort to change the world, a real effort to make peace in the world, isn't as prominent anymore. It may well be inside Peace Corps staff and inside Peace Corps volunteers, but as part of the social conscience or consciousness, it's not. And it really was at the time, and it was certainly motivating the people who worked on that task force. It was certainly motivating President Kennedy, and the principles that were developed and used, and the methodology that was used was really designed to do just that, to change the world and to bring peace. And that hasn't changed at all. So we wanted to not only to give you the historical recovery of what was going on then, but to emphasize that point as well. And another point I want to make that we made last time, go ahead, is that this was a huge problem-solving challenge for Sarge. Let's finish with that table.
President Kennedy did not need to give me a bill. I had only 4 or 5 sentences from the campaign speech in California to go on. It was like seeing a picture of a cake and then being told to bake one. There were no ingredients, no measurements, no idea even of what kinds of substances it would be.
Okay, we talked about this last time, but the task, as Bill said on the document, is not only is the task towering, but the task of doing this. It's one thing to have a recipe, and some people bake cakes well and some people don't. But at least you have the recipe and you know how to follow that, and that has one set of skills. It's another thing to create the recipe in the first place. That's what he was challenged with doing. That's what, as we talked about last time, the purpose of methods are. Good thing I have a prop for my left hand. Do you have the next one? This is a slide from last time. I'll read this one. And just the importance of differentiating the two. That a method is a framework that helps us guide and direct the way we use our minds to discover the solution to a problem. As distinct from recipes, formulas, things like that, which is a framework that helps us to guide and direct the way we use our minds to implement a solution to a problem. So what we're going to talk about, or what we're in the process of talking about today, is how Sarge used his method. We're going to review that briefly to create the formula, which then went into development of Peace Corps programs around the world then and today. Any questions about that? Clear? Okay. Okay. We finished the table.
The fact is that compassion and service can resolve obstacles and grace community around the world. People are hungry for contact, for fellowship, for breaking down barriers.
Sarge couldn't have developed a Peace Corps if he didn't have a method. You just can't do it in 2 weeks or a month unless you have a framework to operate with. He wasn't a methodologist, though. He had a method. He used it. He was terrific at it. In some ways, nobody was better. Nobody has been better. But he wasn't a methodologist. He didn't. He gave public speeches to sell the Peace Corps and to explain what it was doing and to explain why it would work, not to do the kind of thing that I do or that I was taught to do at this university, which is to think theoretically about what people are doing when they're using methods. So this may come across as a statement of his view, his perspective. This is what he thinks the facts are. But a method is it's kind of a thinking cap. It's a way that it frames the way you look at a problem. It frames the variables you focus on. It frames the questions you ask. And I'm going to want to show a slide again, next one, from last time where I compared those two. And this is to recall it for those of you who were here and to put it up here for those who weren't. I really think that even though he makes it as a statement of fact, that there is a methodological or a thinking cap kind of basis for it, and I compared it to scientific or the method in natural sciences, where let's come in this, Debbie, if you don't mind.
Sure, the second.
Second one, the dark one, yeah.
The fact is that mathematical reasoning and quantitative analysis can solve problems of physics, chemistry, and biology anywhere in the world. People are hungry for knowledge, for discovery, for the breaking down of scientific barriers.
So so I'd created that structural parallel, but any questions about that? Is it clear? Okay, nods, head nods, yes.
So when you have a methodology like this, like the SARS, or should one assert that it's capital T true, or do you have to take a look at your problem and select an appropriate methodology for it?
I mean, it's not, I don't know what capital T true is. He does say the fact. But I just noticed my left hand going into my pocket. So I have this. And then Bill smiled at me. He was going to honk again. Clearly the issue is it's not capital T true in the sense of an axiom which you logically, deductively apply. For him, it was empirically true in the sense that you would use it to create policies and procedures which you would then discover worked or not, and so there's an empirical basis to it. I can't remember if my next slide does that or not. No, here's the logic of the memory. You have something to come.
Well, I don't think, if I may say so, that's a fair answer to a very good question. One of the striking things about Shriver was that he was always open to different points of view. And he had an incredible eye for talent. He could see goodness in virtually anybody, including a lot of people that I had trouble seeing goodness in. So an aspect of Sarge's compassion and of his faith was an understanding that he was fallible and that he was open to change. And his staff meetings were like little Platonic symposia, incredible clashes of views. They were not just entertaining. He drew strength from that.
I certainly don't disagree with anything Bill said. So if my answer was unfair, it was probably just poor. But what I wanted to say was this, because I agree. I think the reason that Sarge was all the things that Bill
So,
just said was because
you
he'd
think that comment
internalized the
was
method we're
responsible?
talking about here. He was a compassionate man. He
Yeah.
did open himself to service. So I'll read these. The logic of it is, when we respond to another person out of compassion, we open ourselves to the possibility of being of service. That's a rebuttable presumption, but he's also offering it there and saying, I think this is true. I think this happens. The key thing is, can we be compassionate? And what does that mean? Then, when we are genuinely of service to other people, we transform conflicts and break down barriers. He wants, he would say, this is the way it works. So the task then, the formulation task, is to formulate policies and procedures that enhance the probability that participants will respond to each other out of compassion and open themselves to being of service. If you can build a program that does those things, says Sarge, you can build a program that has a good chance, you have to test it, but it has a good chance of building peace where you don't think that's possible, where it doesn't look like it's possible now. And he embodied that, as Bill said. I wish I'd been at his staff meetings. Any questions about this or thoughts? Dylan?
I guess in some ways what I'm thinking about is sometimes service and being of service to others can be defined differently by different people. And
Yep.
unfortunately, sometimes, service programs, opportunities, things like that actually create more conflict or barriers. So what would you or what would Sarge say about how we work to avoid that, even if we're trying to be genuine?
That's a really good point, and I think I will move forward to try to clear that that up.
Certainly in the next session, they're going to hear about a lot of conflict.
Oh, it's not that there isn't conflict, but the issue is, are we making it worse by serving in a particular way?
And can conflict be useful?
That's a question too. It's unavoidable, and we can learn from it. Do you want to? But the question you raise really is, what do we? Yeah, and you're raising it is, well, what do we mean concretely by compassion? What do we mean concretely by service? And how do we gain some critical control over those behaviors, so that we know that they will do good rather than not? And you have to have a method for that. So yes, could I have the? But he, let's do that.
Did you have a
Hopefully-
question?
No, I'm sure it'll.
You're just waving.
Oh, please, I'm sorry.
I guess I just, I understand the framework. I guess I just wonder, and we'll probably learn more about this, but how a policy can be the best way to arouse compassion in one. Because I find compassion usually cutting through a lot of the ridiculous policies we have to then fix them. Does that make sense? So I wonder about policy being the route to compassion, because I feel like it's strange.
It's strange. Do you have a?
Well, have you been introduced to the fact that there are always many good choices and many bad choices?
Relatively.
Well, we tend to think, many people tend to think, that there is a right course and a wrong course. But none of that is true. There are always competing good courses, as you'll see, and there are also competing bad courses. And one of the skills of a public servant is to try to figure out what will advance policy the best. That's a very, very difficult and important skill. But never make the mistake of saying right or wrong, or yes or no. There are always multiple yes answers that are possible, and unfortunately there are also multiple no answers that are possible.
And if I understand you correctly, what you're talking about, which often happens when we run into policies or procedures, whether they're in government or whether they're in department stores or whether they're in the motor vehicle department or in our families, that there's a gap that shows up between what this policy is making me do, how this policy is channeling what I need to think about, what choices I have, and my own spontaneities, and what seems to be good, and what seems to be reasonable or fair, or any of those gaps between. And certainly policies like that cause a lot of alienation, they cause a lot of problems, they cause trouble. Sarge hated those. And he, this little clip will be an illustration of that. But he tried to build the Peace Corps in such a way that it would minimize that stuff. And as Bill said, last time with regard to the church, he loved the church. He went to mass every day. He prayed the rosary all the time. And every day, meaning even when he was traveling around the world, he did until he died. But if I quote you correctly, he hated. He didn't like clerics who.
No, he hated the clerics.
Who made policy, in this case church policy, ecclesiastical policy, get in the way of the movement of the Spirit. So that's a real problem, and you're absolutely right to focus it, but you'll see some of his passion in making choices about policy in this clip, if you can play that.
May I make another comment?
Yeah, of course.
When I was a University of Chicago student, I don't know whether you're still exposed to this, but we were exposed to a lot of utopian thinking. Plato's Republic, Machiavelli's Prince. One of the things that I was taught when I was at Oxford by Isaiah Berlin was that utopianism is all bunkum. There is no such thing. And to think that there is one creative solution to any problem to the exclusion of all other possible solutions is just wrong. So I don't know whether they still teach all that utopianism in the college, but if they do, beware. It's misleading.
In that regard, what Sarge was interested in, he would agree with Bill, but he did think that if moment by moment, person to person, you could continue to get as close as you could to what was attentive, intelligent, and reasonable, to what was true and what was responsible, you could move incrementally closer to that. You couldn't project it out in advance and then logically apply it. That's tyranny for him. So he, again, we're anticipating things, but he set up the Peace Corps in such a way that Peace Corps volunteers would go out with that kind of approach.
And come back.
And be a certain way. Hit it, Dylan. Yeah, play. Can you hear it? Nicole to the rescue. Try it again.
We're looking for people who have empathy, who are able to live in a foreign culture without worrying about the fact they can't get a hamburger to eat, or a thick shake, or something like that, or there's no automobile. Sometimes I've thought that there's some American tourists and businessmen and others who go overseas and almost have to have a special enclosure around them. They've got to have air piped in from Arizona, otherwise they can't stand it in Africa. I had the experience one time of an official abroad handing me a glove that I could wear so that when I shook hands with the Navy, that I wouldn't get contaminated. So that's the kind of stuff we don't want in the Peace Corps.
There you go. So the questions I had, and see what others you have, following this is, what's the empirical basis for Sarge's methodological approach? How can we say it's true, capital T, small t, hypothetically true? How do we get critical control over terms like compassion and service? How do you know when you're being compassionate? How do you know when you're serving as opposed to not? And then, how did he use this framework to formulate and evaluate the structures, policies, and procedures of the Peace Corps? You had a hint of that in that clip we just saw, where he set up policies so that people would go over there and not expect to wear gloves and have air piped in from Arizona and to drive around in a car, live in a compound. Okay, questions here at this point? Yeah.
I was just going to say, I feel like we have now, which is funny because I was just challenging you a minute ago, but maybe an even stronger empirical basis than we might have been aware of at the time. Like as we learn more about like neurology, psychology, behavioral economics, we know that like when people engage with each other, when they see each other face to face, and when they do good things for each other, there's this like unconscious but very deeply rooted feeling of reciprocity, right? And then take what we know about epidemics, right, and how ideas behave in that same way. And if you can like infect a few people, quote unquote, in these countries with a feeling of reciprocity, with a feeling of friendliness and closeness with the Peace Corps volunteers, that idea could potentially spread through the country and have real kind of political implications in addition to the humanitarian aspect.
It seems like at the time, Sarge had to be operating on a hunch, right? Like
At the time, he had to be operating
on a hunch. Or
on a
at least,
hunch?
Like a certain belief in, like, this is the way we are as human beings. This is the way, like, we respond. And
can you hear back there?
it seems like at the time, Sarge had to be operating on a hunch, or at least like a certain understanding of human nature that he had developed on his own. Because like all that research wasn't available at the time, and I think that's why I find like Sarge fascinating as a man.
Did you hear the? Huh? Well, the comment was, it seems like, and what was your name? Z felt that it seems like Sarge must have been operating on a hunch, that he that all this research that was just mentioned. Tell me your name again.
JC.
JC. That JC had cited wasn't available to him, and so it makes Z fascinated with Sarge that he was able to use this hunch and go forward this way. I mean, I guess I would say he didn't have the research. He'd spent a life paying attention to people and being around the world in various ways in the war and experiment in international living and things like that. And he was and in prayer and knew a lot about how we work. And then there were people have been reflecting on humankind for a while, but you're right, that kind of research wasn't available. So this was out ahead of its time. Still is, alas, in some ways. Okay. Any other questions that you have? Yeah, please.
Related to this, I was wondering, did Sarge use this method in previous work that he did that inspired its application here?
He did. The question was, did he use this method in previous work that he did? He used it here when he integrated when he developed a policy to integrate Catholic high schools and colleges. He was head of the Catholic Interracial Council, and this was in the 1950s, 58, 57. City was segregated. Segregation was a huge issue. He got the local church to condemn racism as a sin that hadn't been done before. I mean, the hierarchy to do that, but that wasn't enough for him. I mean, just to say that it was a sin, it had to be enough. So, and the idea of protesting or picketing or saying integrate your schools wasn't his way. He thought, well, how can I pull on people's compassion? And how can I give them an opportunity to serve, which will change the structures? So he set up a scholarship program, simple as that sounds. He got people, Catholics who were interested in, wanting to do something, and worked with the Catholic high schools and Catholic donors, developed scholarships to Catholic schools for students from students of color from other schools, and got the principals and the monsignors who were running those schools to agree to it, and so he raised the scholarship funds and integrated the schools that way. He set up it sounds simple in a way, but in a certain sense, it's knowing that if people have the compassion to understand somebody else on their own terms and want to make things better and are given an opportunity to do that, and he could think of the systematic way to do that, you change the you change the relationships, you change the system. So he did that way. He had sprinkled through his speeches are recommendations for those kinds of programs and those kinds of proposals, 50 years of them, of ideas like that. So yeah, he did.
Jamie, I think it's also important in answer to your question to note that he was one of the few northern white leaders in the 50s who openly befriended Martin Luther King and who openly espoused principle of nonviolent civil disobedience.
Dylan.
I have a question about the kind of evaluate part of the second question. I wanted to know what methods did he use to evaluate the structures, policies, and procedures of the Peace Corps, given that they're not computers and all sorts of other programs.
Well, he had a. Bill probably knows this better than I do.
I think it's time to start talking about Sam Hayes, Milliken.
I want to. One interlude.
The point for Peace Corps in answer to Dylan's question, because that's really, he confronted a lot of competing ideas.
Right. So I want to do one thing before we do that, and I'm sorry. We'll get to your question, and also we'll be talking about it a lot in the fourth session, because that's when we're going to be talking about how did it work, and how did they know, and what happened when Peace Corps volunteers went into the field. So what I want to do is just talk briefly, or have us look briefly at why does he think, what's the experiential basis for thinking that compassion, whatever that means, can transform conflict. And I wanted to start with having us pay attention to conflict behavior, to what we do when we engage in conflict. So I want to talk about conflict behavior, what we do when we do that, and then take a quick look, or it's not really a look because you can't see it, but consideration of compassion and service as antidotes to that, and then move to the policies that Bill was talking about, because it will inform. We need this to inform the choices he made. So, would you mind reading that one for us?
Conflict behavior
behavior is what we do when we decide to defend ourselves in response to circumstances that we perceive as threatening to us in some way.
Is that okay? Yeah, clear? We feel threatened. A sense of threat of some sort. Threat, sort of a cover word for a whole range of feelings. Uncomfortable, uneasy, scared, furious, all of those things. Okay, next. Thank you. So there are as externalizations or as descriptors of what we do when we're engaging in conflict behavior. There are four types. You're familiar with this one. We always talk about fight as an example. The decision to respond to the situation by being aggressive. Clear enough, right? I presume if there isn't. Can you all? Okay. Then the second one, flight. The decision to respond to the situation by avoiding or getting away from it. Can you all? And this is to move into the empirical side. Can you all identify that? Does this make sense? You have fled, or you have fought or been fought against. Yeah. Okay. Third one, freeze. The decision to respond to the situation by camouflaging or deflecting attention from oneself. You're threatened, you don't fight, you don't run away, you just kind of hope not to be observed. Sort of like animals freezing in their tracks or gathering protective clothing, or does that make sense? We know what we're talking about. Yeah.
Aren't flight and freeze both kind of similar in that they're more avoidance tactics than,
They are avoidance tactics. They are similar like that, and it's different from fight, which just takes it head on. That's right. That's right. They're both they're similar. They're also, I would say, of a type because they are behavior that we do in response to a threat we perceive. It's a different way of dealing with it. Yes.
Is this based upon research now, or is this based upon research methods?
It's based on. This is based on. I suppose you should say now. I mean, I didn't get this from his speeches, although I probably could. I probably could find examples of them. And then the last one, which is another F, fawning as a conflict behavior. It's the decision to respond to the situation by ingratiating oneself or currying favor. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. No, I'm not, that kind of thing. The whole thing with all of these, though, is that they're the external behavior. And if we were to begin to pay attention to all the things we do in threat behavior, I'm sure it wouldn't take us more than about 10 minutes to find some examples that contradict or don't fit in there, or there's a whole other class that's emerging that we can't find a word beginning with F to cover or something like that. It's the problem with descriptive types in general. They are useful classifications, but they're conceptually helpful, but sometimes being aggressive may not be conflict behavior. You can be aggressive and not be operating out of threat. You can avoid something and not be operating out of threat. How are you going to know about that? That's the importance of the next slide, which is to recognize the differentiation between conflict behavior, those four types we've just seen, and the fact that we have minds and we use them. I've been appealing to that when I talk about a sense of threat. I mean, every conflict behavior that we engage in, and probably all of us do all four of those types. Some of us probably lean more toward fleeing than fighting, some more fighting than fawning. Just, it depends, and depends on the situation. And certain instances will do both inside the same thing. But here is, and to get critical control over what Sarge was getting at, is that conflict behavior doesn't happen without the use of our minds, doesn't happen without the use of consciousness. And consciousness itself, the operations of our mind, has a structure. We talked a little bit about this last week, but any decision to fight, any exemplification of a conflict behavior to fight, to take on somebody, in whether verbally or physically or whatever other way, is a function of a decision. Does that make sense? Which in turn is a decision based on some degree of evaluating options, which in turn is based on the fact that we generate options, we deliberate about them, which is in turn based on what we do in valuing or assessing the situation. I guess what I'm asking is, do you all recognize in yourself a pattern of, and this gets to the empirical side of things, when something happens, do you find yourself valuing it? And by valuing, I don't mean having values. I mean saying, well, what significance is this to me? And in conflict behavior, we're talking about, oh, this happened. My felt response to it is unease or threat or anger, or if it's aggressive, or fear if I got to get out of here, or oh no, I didn't mean that if I'm fawning. But there's a valuing that shows up. Does that make sense? Everybody has valued. Everybody knows. You can pay attention to your inner experience in a way to say, oh yeah, I know what the word valuing means. Yeah? Okay. And now then you will also know that that's not the same as your sense experience, right? The data of your consciousness, conscious operations, isn't the same as hearing that or feeling that or what you see. Huh? Same with deliberating. Have you ever generated options? Have you ever thought, I wonder what I could do here? Do you know what I'm talking about? I know this is really, really basic, but in some ways it's also not. And then mulling those over and saying, whoa, which one? You know what I mean by that? Yes. Okay. And then deciding, saying, well, sometimes we take a long time between knowing what we should do and actually pulling the trigger on it, and then we decide. Was that? I saw that hand. Not a hand. That's what scratch. Okay. Now, each of these. So yes. So that we have an empirical consensus here that part of what human consciousness does. I know this is quite simple, and there are neurological factors, and there are psychological factors, and there are all kinds of other factors. But phenomenologically speaking, experientially speaking, there's a pattern of valuing, deliberating, evaluating, and deciding that at least most of you are giving me head nods to say, yeah, that's there.
But this might not always be the case, right? The link between deciding and conflict behavior. Like the way we respond to conflict is often unconscious. And we don't often decide to behave aggressively.
That's right. We may not be explicitly aware. We may find ourselves, you may have, your cell phone might ring, there's a area code come up that you don't, oh no, not that person from LA again. And you shut it off before you even really decide to shut it off. So you're fleeing that phone call. But it doesn't mean you didn't make a decision. It means something was going on that made that decision for you, but you were operating there. You're right. They're not always explicit, and that's the problem, because when we have and it isn't always conflict behavior. We do all kinds of behavior. This is the way it goes. The problem with conflict is that in each of these valuing situations, or the valuing and deliberating, there's a range of performance. Mentioned it a little bit last time. In valuing, we're either mindful of it or we're reactive, somewhere in the range. In deliberating, here's another map, a different one, which includes knowing as well, experiencing, what is it, understanding, is it so, verifying, and I'm talking about this upper loop here. Something happens, what's going on, what is it, so what? And the so what of what significance is to me, I can be attentive or reactive. Not attentive, but mindful or reactive. My deliberating can be open and imaginative, or, on the other hand, kind of constricted. When we, I'm hurrying here because I want to get to these other things. We could spend a lot of time. On this, but when something happens and we experience it as a threat, we tend to be reactive. It narrows our focus. We tend to focus, I mean, what gets triggered for us is something of importance. The feeling of threat is really meaningful, but the meaning isn't often clear. We tend to focus on what did that, or what did she say, or who did that, but what's triggered is either some dire future we don't want to have happen, some practical significance, or some felt sense of ourself. We're focusing inwardly on ourself. That sets the range of what we could do, which is either imaginative or not. Evaluating, we're either conscientious or we're rash. And in deciding, we're either constricted or free. And conflict behavior, the decision to do when we're in conflict, tends to be, not always, but it tends to be reactive, limited, rash, and constrained, which is not the optimal way of decision making. I don't know if, I mean, some of our, but the problem with it is, and see if this registers with your experience, the problem with it is that it excludes, at the same time that, we can, or I can say this and you can maybe notice in yourself that when you're under threat, you tend to be more reactive than mindful. But that we're really certain when we're in conflict, that it excludes all further relevant questions, that we're kind of shrink-wrapped, our consciousness is shrink-wrapped, it happens really fast, it tends to trigger a threat narrative that pretty much specifies what we ought to do, and before we know it, we're acting. And then we're certain. We don't have any questions about what triggered the threat, we don't have any questions about the other person, and we don't really have any questions about what's being threatened, because we are not functioning optimally. So, Sarge's, anyway, let me pause here. That was too many words on my part. Any questions about that, or comments, or valuings? Yeah, please.
So I guess under this model, my question would be, what hope is there to change the way people react to situations of threat rather than methodologically going through the proper steps of deciding?
The question is, given this, or on this model or this assessment of what we're doing when we're in conflict, what hope is there to change it? There are two hopes. At least I'll give you Sarge's answer. I mean, my sort of interpretation of Sarge's answers now. One hope is, as the way human consciousness is constructed, we would all, I think, rather be attentive rather than inattentive. We'd rather be curious and insightful than obtuse. We would rather be critical than uncritical. We'd rather be mindful. We'd rather be imaginative. We'd rather be conscientious. We'd rather be free. So there's a spontaneous normativity to the flow of consciousness. And if it's given the opportunity, and that's all driven by the kind of how open we are to asking questions, how open we are to curiosity. So if something intervenes that enables us to ask questions we couldn't ask before, then there's hope there. Now the final, I mean, so that's, the natural, as it were, for Sarge, would be the natural law explanation for hope. He would also say there's a transcendent ground of hope, which would be there's a spirit moving in the world. There's God. That's the question of God for him, which is there something that we can open ourselves to that would lead us to be, help us to be, want us to be, pull us to be mindful and imaginative and conscientious and free rather than the reverse? And are there systems and stories which make that possible? He thought so. He thought he was building the Peace Corps to do precisely that, to set people up in situations where they were doing that. we should, but one, yes.
So, sorry, can you clarify? So the Peace Corps was made so that people would learn to deal with the conflict.
Yeah.
At that level where they
What Peace Corps was created to make peace, make friends, create a world in which America was, and Americans were understood and accepted, and where governmental and international issues were not transformed, where the threat of being an American, the threat of an American overseas was minimized in a time where the whole world was, it is still, but the whole world was polarized by Cold War dynamics and by superpower dynamics and by all of these post-colonial countries who were being pushed to take sides. And so the threats were enormous. Everybody was. President Kennedy was. You can hear it in his State of the Union address. The country was in a state of contraction, in a state of threat, in a state of conflict, in a very real sense. And so here comes Sarge and says, we need to create this program which will turn this around. And let me just. I guess we can do that. We'll go on to less abstract things. Here we go. So if it, I guess I hope it'd be. Oh, my hand. Would Sarge really have killed me? There are 3 proposals in a program report. Samuel Hayes wrote this, as you see, in September 30th, 1960. That's before Kennedy was elected. And Hayes was a professor at Michigan. So he wrote it in response to all of the students.
No, that's not true.
What is true?
The students came long after that. Sam wrote it spontaneously.
Not long after. If this date is right.
Sam wrote it long before the students.
Oh, October, you're right. He wrote it a month before.
He wrote it long before the students.
He wrote
Sam
it long
understood
before
something.
Who was Sam?
Samuel Hayes wrote a proposal for an international youth service corps. And
But Jamie, you're not being favored to the background here. You're imprisoned by the documents. First of all, you may remember at the last session, I talked a little bit about the mutual security atmosphere that had been created by the Eisenhower-Dulles foreign policy, which was completely oriented toward a response to international communism. Yet there were strains in American foreign policy that rejected that. I mentioned the importance of the Point 4 program of President Truman. And indeed, a number of senators and representatives got a bill passed for what they called the Point 4 Youth Corps. And there was an appropriation to ICA to create a study of the Point 4 Youth Corps. It was contracted to Colorado State and done by Maury Albertson and Pauline Berkey. But it was a proposal of extremely limited imagination. So one of the points that's important to understand is that long before the Michigan uprising, these ideas were very much still in the air. And the atmosphere of people like Senator Hubert Humphrey, who you may know later became vice president and ran for president against Richard Nixon in 1968, he was the prime mover an idealistic, liberal, Democratic senator from Minnesota. He was the prime mover in this effort to create a .4 Youth Corps.
Thank you. There were, as Bill said, a number of ideas floating around. There were 3 specific ones that came to Sarge's task force, plus others, but we have the documents for these. Samuel Hayes' proposal for an international youth corps. Max Milliken's proposal, which was requested by President Kennedy, and you have on your tables the letter that, do you want to talk about that? The letter that that President Kennedy wrote asking Walter Rostow to get Max Milliken to write a proposal for the Peace Corps, because as he says here, I'm sorry to read over his shoulder, it's very possible that it's a mistake to suggest that men and women as young as the immediate post-college age should be sent abroad. Should we not be thinking of some system whereby engineers, teachers, doctors, nurses, social scientists could go while protecting their job tenure and compensation? So he isn't sure what it is. He's worried about the impact. He's worried about it being failure. There's a threat narrative that he has going there. But Max Milliken wrote one that came to the task force. Warren Wiggins and Bill Josephson wrote a proposal. Do you want to talk about that?
I think that that's right. We were unaware of what Sam and what Max Milliken had written. So what they had written had nothing to do with our decision in December of 1960 to write what became the Towering Task. You need to understand that that date of February 1 is a constructed date when the version of the Towering Task that you have in your papers is the sanitized version. Unfortunately, the original version was swamped by Hurricane Sandy because Fried Frank made the mistake of keeping its files in the basement. But there was such a demand for this paper that Warren and I sanitized it, and we slapped that date on it for no apparent good reason. The truth of the matter is that Warren Wiggins was then the #2 person in the Far East region in the State Department, and I was Far East Regional Counsel to that region. And we were concerned about other issues. We were concerned about the reorganization of the foreign aid program, which we thought was totally misguided. We were very concerned about the growingly desperate situation in Vietnam. We not only wrote a paper about that, but Warren, on his own initiative, stopped all civilian travel to Vietnam in December of 1960 on grounds of national security. And we took these 2 papers and we peddled them around to the alleged New Frontiers people, and we were fortunate enough to meet with people like the incoming Assistant Secretary of State for Foreign East Affairs, George McGee, the head of intelligence in the State Department, Tom Hughes, one of Adlai Stevenson's key aides, John Sharon, but they weren't interested. What they kept asking us about was what we thought about the Peace Corps. And of course, we hadn't given any thought to the Peace Corps. But Warren, who was a much more resourceful and creative person than I, Warren sits down to me about Christmas time and says, look, they want to know about the Peace Corps. We need to tell them what we think about the Peace Corps. And that is, in fact, the origin of the Towering Task. We simply sat down and we decided if we were going to run this program, this is entirely hypothetical, you understand. We decided that if we were going to run this program, what should it look like? What are the details? And Warren was much better at that than I, because he had served the foreign aid program in the Philippines. He had served the foreign aid program in Bolivia. He had a keen understanding of what service abroad was like. He even had been an economist in Norway in the Marshall Plan. He was a Harvard economist with everything but his degree, but his PhD. So over Christmas and New Year's, we wrote this paper. And we attached to the paper a pilot program teaching English in the Philippines, a massive program, 100,000 volunteers. And we began peddling the paper. We showed it to everybody whom we had previously met. We managed an appointment with a fellow named Harris Wofford, who you may remember played a key role in the Mrs. Martin Luther King telephone call during the campaign, and who was working for Sarge in the talent search that President Kennedy had asked him to run. This is obviously before the inauguration. And we gave a paper to the State Department bureaucracy that was preparing its own view of what the Peace Corps should be. And one of the intriguing questions, of course, to me at least, is which paper did Sarge read? I know from Harris that Harris walked in with the towering task, not yet named, and Sarge was already reading it. And so when Harris started, I think this is the way to go, Sarge said, well, you're right, but I'm ahead of you. And my strong feeling, and here's one of the lessons to be learned, is never neglect the traditional channels of communication, because I firmly believe that the copy of the towering task that Sarge got was the copy that came from the State Department.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to take a quick look at these proposals. I've excerpted a couple of some of the key differences in them, so you get a sense of if you can put yourself in Sarge's shoes, and you have this problem to solve, and you have this method in your mind about how to do it. Which would you pick and why? So that we have probably two. So this is. There are 2 slides for each of them. Would you please?
Sure. Thousands of young men and women of the United States who each spent from 2 to 3 years in one of the newly developing countries as a junior professional, technical, or clerical aide to those who are engaged in projects and programs of economic and social development in such countries. An aid-to-aid program.
Thank you. Clear about what that is? Yep. Next one, please.
These young men and women cannot normally be very useful in bilateral and multilateral technical and economic cooperation programs because these programs require mature, experienced, highly trained experts and administrators. But many young men and women are eager to fill some useful service in the international arena and as a capstone on their own educations. The program would have tremendous educational and cross-cultural value. In fact, many American colleges and universities might give a year's academic credit for such service.
That's the essence of Sam Hayes'. Oops, there's an N in there, shouldn't be. The Milliken proposal, then, please.
The problem is to devise a new government instrument which can help match the apparent needs of the underdeveloped countries for trained manpower with a swelling supply of dedicated American young people eager to participate in constructive activities in the underdeveloped countries. The program should be launched on a limited pilot basis with no more than a few hundred members employed on tasks now known to be clearly vital to the recipient countries.
Okay, any question about that? Go ahead.
It must, of course, be admitted that such joint efforts, if improperly conceived and poorly administered, can backfire badly and damage rather than improve international understanding. The fact is that we simply do not know a great deal about how to make a program of this kind a success. The program should be undertaken in the conviction that it must be possible to find a sensible way of matching the undoubted enthusiasm and dedication of the young people of the United States for international service with the equally undoubted manpower needs of the underdeveloped countries.
Thank you.
I mean, so far these sound very similar to the Peace Corps. Are they supposed to? They sound very much like what the Peace Corps.
Well,
let's do the third one, and then we can talk about the differences.
well, no, you need to answer a question when it's made. I'm sorry. You know, my training is if a question is answered, you answer the judge.
Answer the judge.
And as far as I'm concerned, Dylan is the judge. So, Dylan, I didn't read the Milliken proposal until after the mythologically famous meeting in the Mayflower Hotel, where Sarge assembled an incredible number of luminaries: Douglas Dillon, the Deputy Secretary of State, the incoming Secretary of the Treasury, Ted Sorensen, President Kennedy's special counsel. You know, I had never been in a group like that. And in front of everybody on this table was a copy of the Towering Task. And what he said to everybody was, I think this is the best expression of what the Peace Corps should be. I want you to take a few minutes, all of you, to turn the pages and read it, and let's discuss it. And if you have read the Milliken proposal in your papers, I think you may come to the conclusion that I came to, which is that it is long, badly written, turgid, boring, and risk-adverse. Exactly what would turn Sarge off, and I do certainly believe that it did. I think Sam had the values right, and I think Max had the values completely wrong.
I mean, the fact that Max would say, the fact is we simply do not know a great deal about how to make a program of this kind of success, and we should therefore try a bunch of experiments to see what'll work, isn't where Sarge was coming from. He did think he knew how to make a program a success. He did have a method. Sam doesn't, and he's worried about what'll happen if, Max, what'll happen if you do this on very big scale. So we need to send a few hundred people, see what works, and take some time to figure that out. The other proposal was, Nicole?
I was going to ask kind of where that confidence came from, that he knew that it could be a success. Because that seems pretty confident.
That seems pretty what?
Confident that
Confident.
You'll be able to make it a success.
You know, he didn't know. I mean, it had to be proved, and he regarded what he came up with as a working, kind of a working hypothesis. That's the phrase that was used in the final proposal. But in the same way that you, Nicole, as you're studying your intertidal snails and doing your PhD research, are confident that if you rely on the methodologically valid work of geneticists who came before you, and you are confident of the fact that the world, including snails, including the impact of global climate of global warming on their movements and migrations, is somehow mathematically intelligible, and that if you pay attention to the right variables in your research, you will contribute to the advancement of knowledge on climate change, on snails, and so forth, right? So
I disagree with that about 100%.
Okay, well, let me finish my point. Because I must not have been clear. I don't think you do.
I do. And I'd like to be permitted to say why.
Please, Judge.
If you have been around, even for a short time on the Earth, you have to be very alert, first of all, to to draw inferences from your failures. Understand why you failed. Think about what you should do the next time around to succeed. And if you're thorough in doing that, you should develop a sense of comfort in your own feelings about what should be done when you're presented with alternatives, even conflicting alternatives. And I think the remarkable thing about Sarge was that he, who had grown up in a faith-oriented family home, who had experienced the Depression where his father lost every dime, who was a scholarship boy at school and at Yale, who commanded a anti-aircraft battery on the USS South Dakota during World War II, in which every person around him was killed, who had successfully helped to create the merchandise mart out of nothing. Sarge had learned to trust his feelings. And I think that he did not do that in the kind of methodologically precise way. I think he just had arrived at a point in his life where he knew for himself what he thought would work and what he thought wouldn't work.
He wasn't a methodologist, but he had one. So I agree. And he was pretty precise. He was pretty consistent. So here we go. Where are we? Could you please?
Sure. The organization and administration of a large number of Americans working on a variety of programs and projects in many countries and varying cultures and needs undeniably is an extremely complex and difficult undertaking. Yet if the overall program is launched at the 1,000 to 2,000 youth level, it will be more likely to fail in the absolute sense than at a level, say, 5 or 10 times greater. Generally speaking, such small numbers won't be significant enough in the recipient countries to get the governmental and institutional attention it needs. A small, cautious National Peace Corps may be worse than no Peace Corps at all.
This is the towering task, obviously.
I also want to comment that we were unaware at that time in writing the towering task of the University of Michigan Student Initiative. We, of course, knew about the Cow Palace speech, but we did not know the extent to which young people no different than yourselves at that time were the creative political impetus for the Peace Corps. So one lesson you might want to draw from that is to have confidence in how you want to change society.
Thanks. Please.
However, if the program is launched at a considerably higher level and selected countries can receive a number large enough to do an important national job, it will merit attention abroad and will have the potential of developing into a major asset of mutual importance. America ought to consider initiating the program with several thousand Americans in the first 12 to 18 months, say 5,000 to 10,000. The ultimate level of manpower to be utilized in this program will, of course, depend upon its initial success and difficulties. However, the potential of this program is great, and it may prove to be the case that it should be at the 30,000 to 50,000 or possibly even at the 100,000 level.
Sarge liked this one. Why? Yes.
There's kind of like a dream big phenomenon about it, and it doesn't really shy away with being careful. It's saying, this is urgent, we need to do this, and we're gonna have 5 to 10,000 people, and it's using big numbers. There's no rhetoric that's kind of like, we're scared. But it's very American in that it's like, we're just gonna go and do things.
Go big or go home.
Yeah.
I think it's because there's a very clear idea of what the Peace Corps is for and what is required in order to make it succeed.
Can you hear back there?
I think like compared to the other
That
programs.
it's that's a very clear idea of what the Peace Corps,
The objectives of the Peace
objectives
Corps
of the Peace Corps.
are, why it's being set up,
And why it's being set
what
up.
is required for it, that I think the other programs do not.
the context of, yes. Sir?
I would argue it's also, I think, the last sentence in the first paragraph around mutual importance, that this is also showing that not only are we providing a service, but we're getting it, which harps back to his earlier statements.
Yeah, there's a mutuality in this one. Yes, Dan?
Also, this was the time of the new Kennedy administration when we want to send people to the moon, not to Antarctica. You know, it's so I think that everyone was thinking of reaching big. I wonder what Bill would say about that.
Well, I think you're exactly right, but it's also true that Warren and I were completely unaware of that side of it. We really had no idea how many people would volunteer, and we had no idea what their quality would be, and we had no idea of what the political implications of that were. We were looking at the program solely from the point of view of its utility overseas and of providing an opportunity for service to see if people would take advantage of that opportunity for service under these conditions, the conditions that President Kennedy had spelled out in the Cow Palace speech, and which became hallmarks of the Peace Corps. No pay, no privileges and immunities from local criminal and civil process, no PX privileges, no living in embassy and AID sheltered environments. Remember, one of the salient books at that time was The Ugly American. And we were determined both to provide an antidote to The Ugly American and to capture the word peace, which the Russians and the Communist Internationalists had effectively captured even on the University of Chicago campus in the 50s. There was the Labor's Youth League. There was the Socialist Youth League. They had all been to the Stockholm Peace Conference. They had been to other youth conferences that the Soviets had held around the world. We had lost control of the word peace as it related to American and international youth.
Question here.
Yeah, so we've talked about students and whether or not they would be interested in participating in a program like this, but we haven't, and I don't see it in these proposals so far, whether or not these countries are interested in hosting Americans. So could you talk about that? So I think that for the Peace Corps now, like countries request Peace Corps volunteers and then they're sent depending on like security issues and all of that. But when it was being conceptualized, was that a concern as well?
Yes, that's
well, you'll learn in the next session that one of the first things that Sarge did after he was appointed was to go around the world. And we'll be documenting that trip in the next session, and we'll be sharing with you the statement that he issued when he returned to Chicago at the end of that trip, which is a remarkable piece of work for two reasons. It is a report on all the countries that had formally requested Peace Corps volunteers. But it's also, I'm sorry to say, a remarkable Cold War document.
But your question is exactly right. I mean, what this proposal and what the other proposals don't deal with is, isn't it won't it generate a threat to just drop 5,000, 30,000, 50,000 Americans? I mean, can you imagine a proposal to have 5,000 Iranian teachers come to Chicago? That would generate, unless it were properly prepared and thought about. So there were some other policies that had to be developed and that the task force did develop and put into the final report over those 3 weeks from the date I had on there, February 1st, the constructed date, to the 22nd, which is the real date that the proposal was submitted for the Peace Corps. And what the next couple of slides show is the proposals that were built in there to deal with that. And what I'd like, as we read through these, again, around maybe one at a time, but what I'd like is to think about how might each of these proposals work if you were to either be in the program, depending upon which one it is, or receiving the program to minimize your threat and enhance your openness to the threats you might encounter. Can we keep going? Yeah.
The essential idea is the placement of Americans in actual operational work in developing areas of the world. Can we stop there?
No, you can. That's the put people to work in developing areas. Not an aid-to-aid program, but direct work. Go ahead.
Certain skepticism about the coming of Americans is to be expected in many quarters. Hostile local groups and Soviet and Chinese propagandists will no doubt do everything in their power to promote active hostility. There are, however, steps that should be taken to dispel the notion that the Peace Corps is merely an attempt to export surplus American spiritual or political zeal, and to show that the Peace Corps is not advanced as an arm of the Cold War, or a diplomatic or propaganda venture, but rather as a contribution to the world community and as a genuine experiment in international partnership.
So they were thinking about that. Number one.
Peace Corps men and women will go to teach or to build or to work in the communities to which they are sent.
They will serve local institutions, living with the people they are helping.
Please.
Peace Corps will establish procedures with the host countries for the appraisal of each project in terms of the particular country's priorities.
When there is no pressing need or desire, no Peace Corps volunteer should be sent.
Pending the imminent reorganization of our foreign aid structure and program, Peace Corps should remain a semi-autonomous functional unit launched with its own identity and spirit.
Let's do the other five, and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
Peace Corps will organize training programs with great emphasis on language instruction and preparation for the particular work to be inside.
Peace Corps volunteers should live in modest circumstances and as closely as possible to their host country counterparts.
Peace Corps volunteers should be given just enough to provide a minimum decent standard of living.
Some special health requirements might have to be met, but basically volunteers must avoid all conspicuous consumption.
There should be no general age limit or restriction to one's sex.
And then we'll do the next one, which is Sarge's summary of this. Go. Whoever.
The rules are very few and simple. First, learn the language of the people with whom you work. Second, make up your mind that the work of developing nations is worth the price of personal sacrifice. Third, anchor yourself in the customs and traditions of the country where you are serving. Fourth, take your standard of living down near enough to the local level to make it possible to mix freely and easily with the people. Get down to eye level with them. Fifth, be in the power of personal integrity, humility, and determination.
Thank you. All right, let's do the last one, then we'll talk.
Peace Corps volunteers are not trained diplomats. They are not propagandists. They are not technical experts. They represent our society by what they are, what they do, and the spirit in which they do it. They steer clear of intelligence activity and stay out of local politics. Our strict adherence to these principles has been a crucial factor in the decision of politically uncommitted countries to invite American volunteers into their midst, into their homes, and even into their classrooms and schoolyards to teach future generations of national leaders. In an era of sabotage and espionage, intelligence and counterintelligence, The Peace Corps and its volunteers have earned a priceless yet simple renown. They are trustworthy.
So what do you think? Do those just seem like rules, or do they seem like rules that might work?
Well, I think it's important, Jamie, for the audience to understand the setting from which this report was derived. Sarge convened an extraordinary number of people, for example, Nick Hobbs, the head of the psychology department in University of Vanderbilt in Nashville, to develop a selection battery. Larry Dennis and Joe Kaufman from the University of Wisconsin to develop a university-based training program. Gordon Boyce, the head of the Experiment in International Living, which of course had a wealth of experience in the operation of overseas programs, but not in the developing world, with American youth. And Al Sims, another academic who was responsible for developing university-administered programs overseas. So we had this concept that there would be directly administered programs, there would be private agency-administered programs, and there would be university-administrative programs. And all of these concepts found their place in the report that Jamie has excerpted. But you might be interested in actually how the report was written. So, a wonderful State Department person named Charles Nelson sat in office and did a first draft. Charlie was extremely programmatically sound. I sat in the next office turning Nelson's prose into English. Harris Wofford, who's quite a wordsmith, turned my product into a persuasive political document. And what did Wiggins do? Wiggins ran back and forth among the three of us, carrying the various drafts to each of us until we finally agreed on a consensus document to give to Sarge. So never forget the importance of the runner.
Let's go back to the other. I guess the point I would want to make functionally is if you can imagine yourself in a village in the Philippines or Uganda or the Gabon or wherever the India where the first programs were set up, and suddenly one or two Americans show up. You've been invited by the government, and you have a job, and you're connected to a counterpart, and that gives you some legitimacy, which was important. You aren't just dropped in. But my guess is that for a lot of people, there wouldn't be not only curiosity, but there would be suspicion, there might be hostility, there might be a sense of threat, like we talked about earlier. And there might not be a whole lot of curiosity about who you were in your own terms. And people might already think that you were a member of the CIA, that you were here to exploit them in some way or another. It didn't always happen. People are wonderful everywhere, but that's the kind of thing that can be expected. And the question would be, how do you set up a program? How do you develop Peace Corps training and policies and procedures which make it most probable for that to be overcome? You do a number of the things that were talked about here. Instead of showing up and saying, let me tell you how to fix your child health programs, or let me tell you how to grow corn better, or let me tell you how to, you come and you say, what do you need? Instead of doing it in English or asking if somebody speaks English, you do it in their language. Instead of living in the compound with the expats and the ambassador, you live in the house or tent or whatever it is next door. In operating in the culture, you move with the way of living that's going on there. All of these things set up to de-link the threat, to get people curious, to open up conversation, and to allow people to exchange on their own terms. And to that degree, this happens. This was a report. This is a report 2 years later. You need to do those sorts of things to, to let people into your classrooms or schoolyards, or even to take their advice. So there was a peace-building model built into what Peace Corps volunteers would do. People like any of us would come in, and then we would be told, well, you have to learn the language. Well, you have to live in a certain way. This is how much you're going to be paid. This is how you should comport yourself. If this isn't working for you, you can leave at any time. We don't want you causing trouble. You don't have to stay. And then there's the issue that Sarge said. Can we do the prior slide? Just, yeah. No, the...
Oh, you're getting ahead of yourself again.
Again. Take your... believe in the power of personal integrity, humility, and determination. For any of you who have, in the face of conflict behavior, not responded with conflict, but responded with curiosity. There's sometimes some pain, or there's sometimes some suffering that goes on along with that. And that's what Sarge was talking about. His slogan, as I understand it, he came up with the slogan, maybe Bill can correct me on this, but the slogan for the longest time of the Peace Corps was, the toughest job you'll ever love. And I think that's probably the best one. We're close to the end. You wanted to...
Well, I think you're out of time. I see Dylan standing there giving you that signal, and I think we have a lot to say that we haven't been able to get to. But I want to come back to some of these issues, if it's okay with you.
Absolutely.
At our next session. But before I do that, particularly since this is the Institute of Politics, and we're all here because we have a concern for public service. I want to read something from the State of the Union that I think is exactly on point here. I would like to conclude with a few remarks about the state of the executive branch. We have found it full of honest, useful public servants, but their capacity to act decisively at the exact time action is needed has too often been muffled in the morass of committees, timidities, and fictitious theories, which have created a growing gap between decision and execution, between planning and reality. In a time of rapidly deteriorating situations at home and abroad, this is bad for public service, and particularly bad for the country. And we intend to make a change. I have pledged myself and my colleagues in the cabinet to a continuous encouragement of initiative, of responsibility, of energy in serving the public interest. Let every public servant know, whether his post is high or low, that a person's rank and reputation in this administration will not be determined by the size of the job he does, and not by the size of the staff, or of his office, or of his budget. Let it be clear that this administration recognizes the value of dissent and daring, that we greet healthy controversy as the hallmark of healthy change. Let the public service be a proud and lively career. The next day, that sign, "Let the public service be a proud and lively career," went up in every single government office.
Thank you, Bill and Jamie, so much for today. Let's give them a round of applause. I like that slogan. I think we should have that around here too.
You should put it up on the wall here.
We should. I'll take it in my office for sure. So just a couple of things. Now from 2 to 3, we are more than happy to have anybody who would like to stay and join us to talk with Jamie and Bill more about some of the material that we've covered. At the same time, we know people may have class or that sort of thing, so that's not at all required, just an offer. Similarly, I will be here if you have questions about the fellowship or other components of the program, and I'm happy to answer those. And then finally, next week, we'll make sure to get you information about next week, but it's a week from today. Same deal, 12 o'clock lunch, kind of 12:20, 12:30 start, and we're going to be delving into, do you remember the title of next week? We're looking at the challenge of politics, very, very relevant. So we hope to see all of you here next week. And then finally, Nicole will be following up, and we'll make sure you have access to the Dropbox, which will have the video and the documents, Bill's reference, and that sort of thing. So. Yeah, next week we will be in OMSA across the street, 5710, and so we will just make sure you guys know that. So thanks. That's all. Thank you. Is this off?
Yes.
Okay.
You know, Jamie.
All right. Oh yeah, good to see you.
With the whole shoot or?
Cool.